The CIA spent $40 million building the plan. Britain sent 3 SAS and solved it in a night: Kosovo and Albania. March to June 1999. NATO air campaign. 8,000 feet above the Balkans, American fighter jets were dropping ordnance on coordinates that an intelligence apparatus employing thousands of people and spending more money than most small countries had in an entire year was gradually confirming were actually significant military targets. Below the bombing campaign, at the level where human sources were being recruited, maintained, and controlled, the CIA's counter-Milosevic operation was proceeding methodically, expensively, and very slowly. 3 British SAS soldiers were camped in the Drenica Valley near the Kosovo-Albania border, equipped with a map, a radio, and the ability to see things that were moving in daylight in front of them. By the end of the 3rd day, the SAS team had identified and guided NATO airstrikes onto Serbian Army command and control nodes that the CIA's 8-month-old program, consuming resources that dwarfed what 3 men and their kit could cost, had not been able to locate with the precision required to target them. This is the story of how the most expensive intelligence program the CIA had running in the region was made nearly irrelevant by 3 men who were operating from a position where they could see the problem directly instead of trying to solve it through the prism of recruited agents and signals intercept and institutional processes. The NATO air campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia had begun on March 24, 1999. General Wesley Clark, the Supreme Allied Commander, had been given the mission of degrading the military capability of Slobodan Milosevic's regime and forcing a cessation of the ethnic cleansing campaigns that had been underway in Kosovo. The air campaign was massive and unprecedented. Stealth fighters were conducting strikes deep inside Serbia. Cruise missiles were being launched from naval platforms in the Adriatic. Tomahawk land attack missiles were being fired from the Black Sea. An air campaign of extraordinary scope was being brought to bear against a small Balkan state that was defending itself with aging Soviet air defense systems and the kind of military equipment that was left over from the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. The campaign represented the first extended employment of NATO air power against a sovereign nation, and the political stakes were substantial. If the air campaign failed, if Milosevic did not capitulate, NATO would face the choice of either committing ground forces or accepting defeat. Neither option was politically acceptable to the alliance. The success of the air campaign was not just a military necessity, it was a political imperative that would define the credibility of NATO itself. For the NATO air campaign to work, the targeting process had to produce usable coordinates. The NATO command structure had established a targeting cell that was supposed to translate strategic objectives into specific military targets, develop the coordinates for those targets, and ensure that the air campaign was hitting things that actually mattered. This targeting process was laborious. It required human intelligence to identify where things were. It required signals intelligence to confirm what the human intelligence sources were reporting. It required imagery intelligence from satellites and reconnaissance aircraft to develop precise coordinates. And it required the kind of bureaucratic coordination that allowed the American Air Force, the American Navy, the British Air Force, the French Air Force, and the air forces of a dozen other NATO countries to operate on a coordinated targeting schedule. The process involved multiple levels of review. Targets had to be validated to confirm they met the legal standards for military necessity. Potential civilian casualties had to be assessed. The strategic value of the target had to be confirmed. And all of this had to be accomplished in a manner that satisfied not just military commanders, but political leaders in a dozen different countries who were watching the operation and evaluating whether the campaign was worth the political cost. The CIA had been running a program against Milosevic for months before the air campaign began. The program had cost millions of dollars. It had involved the recruitment of agents inside Yugoslavia, the development of intelligence networks, the maintenance of communication systems, and the kind of patient intelligence work that the CIA understood how to conduct. When the air campaign began, the program was repurposed to support the targeting process. The CIA was supposed to produce intelligence about where the Yugoslav military was positioned, where command and control elements were located, where air defense systems were situated, and where the infrastructure that supported military operations was actually located. The program had multiple layers. Case officers in the field were managing networks of agents. Analysts in headquarters were processing the raw intelligence and developing assessments. Communications specialists were maintaining secure channels back to the agents in the field. Support personnel were managing the logistics of the operation. The entire operation was embedded within the broader intelligence community apparatus, which meant it had to coordinate with other agencies, had to share intelligence through established channels, and had to report through the diplomatic chain as well as through purely military channels. The challenge was that the CIA network, however well developed, was still operating through agents and from the outside looking in. The intelligence that the network produced was good, but it was inherently delayed. An agent would report that military activity had occurred at a particular location. The report would have to be transmitted through a secure channel. The report would have to be analyzed. The coordinates would have to be verified. And by the time the targeting cell had processed the report and generated bombing coordinates, the Yugoslav military might have moved the asset, or the situation might have changed. Intelligence from human sources was always inherently delayed compared to the moment when the intelligence became obsolete. For strategic intelligence, understanding the enemy's intentions, assessing the command structure, predicting how the enemy would respond to airstrikes, this delay was acceptable. But for tactical intelligence about mobile targets, about specific units in specific locations, about time-sensitive military movements, the delay was often fatal to the value of the intelligence. The SAS presence in Kosovo was much smaller and much less documented. 3 soldiers, the exact designation of their unit and their names remain classified, had been inserted into the Drenica Valley to provide NATO with close access to the KLA positions and to serve as liaison between the KLA command structure and the NATO Operations Center. The 3 soldiers were there in an advisory capacity, but they were there in person, on the ground, observing the same territory where the Yugoslav military was operating. They had been selected for this mission because they had the combination of language skills, tactical expertise, and intelligence collection training that would allow them to work effectively with the KLA. They had been briefed extensively on the KLA's command structure, on the tribal and political dynamics within the rebel movement, on the areas where the KLA had influence, and the areas where the KLA's presence was contested. They had been equipped with secure radios, with GPS technology, with maps that had been updated with the latest intelligence about Yugoslav positions, and with the authority to call for airstrikes if they identified appropriate targets. The Drenica Valley was the heartland of the KLA's forward positions. It was high ground overlooking Serbian army positions. It was an area where movements would be visible if someone was positioned to see them. It was also an area that was getting bombed regularly as NATO tried to disrupt the Yugoslav military operations in central Kosovo. The SAS team was embedded with the KLA for a specific reason: to provide spot reports on what the Yugoslav military was doing, to help guide NATO airstrikes onto targets that could be seen from the ground, and to provide the human intelligence that would make the air campaign more effective. The 3 men understood the mission. They understood that they were not there to conduct combat operations themselves. They were there to observe, to report, and to provide the ground truth that would allow air operations to be more precisely targeted. They were there to be the eyes for NATO's air force. On the morning of the 3rd day, the SAS team observed a movement along a ridgeline to the south of their position. The movement was significant because it involved military vehicles, because it was moving under cover of darkness in a pattern that suggested command and control operations rather than simple military movement, and because it was moving in a direction that suggested it was heading toward a position where command elements might be consolidated. The movement was consistent with a strategic shift in Yugoslav military operations. Intelligence assessments had indicated that Milosevic was beginning to consolidate his command structure in response to the air campaign, moving senior command elements to less vulnerable locations. If the SAS team's observation was correct, if this movement represented the consolidation of Yugoslav command elements, then the target was not just tactically significant, it was strategically significant. The disruption of Yugoslav command and control operations at this point in the campaign could have ripple effects on the entire Yugoslav military response. The SAS team had binoculars, map and compass, and the ability to read terrain in a way that made tactical sense. The team calculated the position using terrain association and visual landmark references. They confirmed the position using GPS. They compiled the information into a spot report, and they transmitted the report through their communications system to the NATO Operations Center, giving the targeting cell a specific location where what appeared to be a significant military movement was occurring. The report included precise coordinates, a description of the vehicles observed, an assessment of the tactical significance of the movement, and a recommendation that airstrikes be considered against the location. The report was transmitted in real time, meaning the targeting cell received the information while the military movement was actually occurring, while the target was physically present at the location being described. The difference between the CIA report and the SAS report was timing. The CIA report would have come from an agent, filtered through a control officer, transmitted through secure channels, analyzed by intelligence personnel, and packaged for the targeting cell. The process might take hours or days. The SAS report was transmitted immediately, was based on direct observation of current activity, and was time-stamped with the exact moment the observation was made. The targeting cell could act on the SAS report within minutes. The targeting cell could have air assets redirected to the coordinates while the military movement was still in progress. The CIA report, by the time it had been fully processed and validated, might describe activity that had already concluded or that had moved to a different location. One system was optimized for producing strategic understanding. The other system was optimized for enabling tactical action. The first airstrike was on target 32 minutes after the SAS team transmitted the initial spot report. The strike disrupted the military movement. The Yugoslav military assets in the area were damaged or destroyed, and the SAS team, observing from their position, I confirmed the strike results and transmitted the battle damage assessment back to the operations center. The confirmation was valuable for the targeting cell because it provided immediate feedback about whether the airstrike had accomplished its objective. If the strike had missed or had been ineffective, if the military movement had successfully dispersed, the targeting cell would know immediately and could direct additional airstrikes against the dispersed elements. The feedback loop was immediate and precise in ways that traditional intelligence collection could not match. The significance of this was not that the CIA program was bad. The CIA program was well run, professionally executed, and delivered significant intelligence throughout the air campaign. The significance was that in a situation where direct observation was possible, direct observation was infinitely more valuable than intelligence that came through any other channel. The SAS team could see what was happening. The CIA program was trying to infer what was happening through agents and signals intercept. When it came to identifying targets that were mobile and time-sensitive, the direct observation capability was overwhelmingly superior. The lesson extended beyond just this single operation. It suggested something fundamental about the nature of modern warfare and the value of human intelligence collectors positioned where they could actually observe the military activity they were reporting on. The SAS team continued to operate in the Drenica Valley for the remainder of the first week of the air campaign. They conducted additional spot reports on significant military movements. They guided additional airstrikes. They provided the NATO targeting cell with the kind of actionable intelligence that allowed the air campaign to strike moving targets in real time instead of targeting fixed positions that had been identified hours or days earlier, and that might no longer contain the targets when the strike arrived. The value of their presence became increasingly apparent to the NATO command structure. What had seemed like a small advisory mission at the beginning of the campaign was turning into a significant force multiplier for air operations. By the second week of the campaign, the pattern was established. The CIA program was providing strategic intelligence about the broader command structure and the overall military positioning. The SAS team was providing tactical intelligence about specific movements and specific targets that could be struck immediately. The two intelligence streams were complementary, but they were operating on different timelines and at different levels of operational scope. Neither stream could fully substitute for the other. The CIA program could provide strategic understanding that the SAS could not provide. The SAS could provide tactical accuracy that the CIA could not match. What became clear was that the air campaign was more effective with both streams operating in parallel than it would have been with either stream operating alone. The question that this raised in the minds of the NATO targeting cell and in the minds of the commanders who saw the intelligence flowing into the operations center was whether the $40 million that the CIA had spent to build their intelligence program against Milosevic was money well spent compared to 3 men with a map and a radio who could see what was actually happening. It was a question that touched on something fundamental about military spending, about institutional efficiency, about return on investment. The question implied a challenge to the CIA's value, but the question was actually more nuanced than a simple value judgment. The answer, of course, was that both programs had value. The CIA program was providing the strategic understanding that allowed the air campaign to understand the broader objectives and the overall military structure. The SAS team was providing the tactical information that allowed specific airstrikes to be conducted against time-sensitive targets. But the answer also contained an uncomfortable truth. In a situation where direct observation was possible, the value of the institutional intelligence program was substantially diminished. The two programs were measuring value in different ways. The CIA program had been designed to answer big strategic questions. The SAS team was answering immediate tactical questions. Both were valuable. But at that particular moment, with the air campaign demanding immediate tactical intelligence, the SAS value was more apparent. The SAS team was in the Drenica Valley for a specific reason, and that reason had nothing to do with providing tactical air support. The team was there to maintain NATO contact with the KLA, to understand the KLA's capabilities and intentions, and to ensure that the KLA was maintained as a viable force that could operate in conjunction with NATO operations. Providing spot reports for airstrikes was a secondary mission that they had volunteered to take on once they realized that the opportunities were available. The presence of the SAS team in the valley, combined with the air campaign, created a synergy that was greater than either element operating alone could have achieved. The KLA, now operating with real-time air support guided by on-the-ground advisors, became a much more effective military force. The Yugoslav military, facing coordinated KLA attacks combined with airstrikes that seemed to come with uncanny accuracy, began to adopt more defensive postures. The momentum of the campaign shifted. The mechanics of the spot report and the airstrike happened in minutes. The SAS observers would locate the target using visual observation and binoculars. The observers would use terrain association and landmark reference to estimate the location. The observers would confirm the location using GPS technology. The observers would compile the information into a spot report that included the target description, the estimated location, the bearing and distance from a known reference point, and an assessment of the target's significance and urgency. The spot report would be transmitted through secure radio communications to the SAS Tactical Operations Center. The Operations Center would receive the spot report and would immediately forward the information to the NATO Operations Center where the targeting cell was located. The targeting cell would receive the spot report and would have to make an immediate decision about whether to divert air assets to strike the target or whether to cue the target for strike by available air assets. The advantage of the spot report over intelligence that came through other channels was the immediacy and the specificity. The spot report was describing a target that was moving in real time. The spot report was describing a target that could be struck while it was still in the location described in the spot report. The targeting cell could have air assets strike the target within minutes of receiving the report, while the target was still present at the location. This was fundamentally different from intelligence that came from agents or from signals intercept. Agent intelligence usually came with a lag. An agent would report that activity had occurred at a location. The report would have to be transmitted through secure channels. The report would have to be analyzed. The coordinates would have to be calculated. By the time the targeting cell had processed the agent report, the activity might have moved elsewhere or the situation might have changed. But the fact that 3 men operating with minimal resources and minimal institutional support could identify and guide airstrikes onto targets that the CIA program had not been able to locate was significant to how NATO understood the air campaign. It meant that the air campaign could be more effective if additional SAS teams could be inserted at other positions where direct observation of Yugoslav military activity was possible. It meant that the combination of a comprehensive institutional intelligence program and small tactical intelligence collection capability was more effective than either capability operating alone. General Wesley Clark understood this principle. Clark had spent enough time in Bosnia and had seen enough of the Balkan situation to understand that direct observation had unique value in a region where the military situation was changing rapidly and where assets were mobile. Clark requested additional SAS teams be inserted to provide direct observation coverage of other critical areas where NATO wanted to understand what the Yugoslav military was doing. The request was approved. Additional teams were inserted. The pattern repeated itself. Direct observation of military movements, spot reports transmitted to the operations center, airstrikes on time-sensitive targets, battle damage assessment to confirm the results. After the success of the first SAS team in the Drenica Valley, General Wesley Clark approved the insertion of additional SAS teams at other critical locations in Kosovo and in the surrounding areas. The additional teams were inserted into positions where they could observe Yugoslav military activity and could provide spot reports on moving targets. By the third week of the air campaign, there were 6 SAS teams operating at various locations throughout Kosovo and the surrounding areas. Each team was providing spot reports on Yugoslav military activity in their respective areas of operation. Each team was enabling the targeting cell to conduct airstrikes on moving targets that the air campaign would not have been able to identify and target through other intelligence channels. The presence of multiple SAS teams provided NATO with a comprehensive picture of Yugoslav military movements throughout the area of operations. The teams were in positions where they could see major movement routes. The teams were in positions where they could observe concentration areas where the Yugoslav military was gathering forces. The teams were in positions where they could identify command and control locations where senior Yugoslav military officers were conducting operations. The expansion of the SAS presence from 1 team to 6 teams represented a significant force multiplier for the NATO air campaign. The expansion allowed NATO to conduct airstrikes on a much broader range of targets. The expansion allowed NATO to shift from targeting fixed military installations to targeting moving military assets and command and control infrastructure. The strategic consequence was that the Yugoslav military became less capable of coordinating large-scale operations, less capable of maintaining unified command and control, and increasingly forced to operate in small, dispersed units that were harder to coordinate and less effective militarily. By the end of the first month of the air campaign, the SAS teams that were embedded with various KLA units and operating at various positions throughout Kosovo and the surrounding areas had become a significant force multiplier for the NATO air campaign. The teams were not conducting combat operations themselves. The teams were not engaging in direct fire combat with Yugoslav military forces, but the teams were enabling the air campaign to be more effective by providing real-time intelligence on moving targets and on the location of high-value military assets. The presence of the SAS teams had forced the Yugoslav military to begin incorporating air defense measures into their operational planning. The Yugoslav military was learning that movement in certain areas was dangerous, that concentrations of forces were vulnerable to air attack, that command elements had to be even more dispersed and more mobile to avoid detection by these on-the-ground observers. The CIA program did not diminish in value. The CIA program continued to provide strategic intelligence that fed into the broader understanding of Yugoslav military intentions and capabilities. But the relative value of the CIA program compared to the SAS capability had shifted. The SAS capability was demonstrably more effective at finding and enabling the targeting of time-sensitive military assets. The SAS capability could do in a day what the CIA program might require a week to accomplish, because the SAS capability was operating from a position where the information could be seen directly rather than inferred from agent reporting. The tension between these two approaches, the comprehensive institutional approach and the focused tactical approach, would shape how military organizations thought about intelligence collection for decades to come. The economics of intelligence gathering revealed something fundamental. The $40 million that the CIA had spent on their intelligence program against Milosevic had been spent over 8 months. The program had involved the recruitment of dozens of agents, the maintenance of communication networks, the operation of safe houses, and the kind of logistics and support infrastructure that made an intelligence network functional. The program had produced valuable intelligence about the structure of the Yugoslav military, about Milosevic's intentions and capabilities, and about the broader political situation in the Balkans. The 3 SAS soldiers in the Drenica Valley were costing NATO a fraction of that amount. The soldiers had been trained and equipped by the British military, which meant that their training cost was already paid for. The soldiers were being deployed as part of a military operation, which meant that their personnel cost was embedded in the broader military budget rather than being attributed to the intelligence program. The logistic support for the soldiers was being provided by NATO, which meant that those costs were distributed across multiple nations. But the direct question of return on investment was starkly clear. For a much smaller investment in personnel and logistics, the SAS teams were producing intelligence that was more time-sensitive and more actionable than intelligence that the CIA program could produce, despite the much larger investment in human sources and institutional structure. This raised a question about the fundamental economics of intelligence gathering. There was value in building an intelligence network that could provide comprehensive, multi-sourced information about an adversary's intentions and capabilities. There was also value in positioning human observers in locations where they could directly see what an adversary was doing. The CIA model was comprehensive. The SAS model was focused but immediate. Neither model was superior to the other, but they were operating at different price points and delivering intelligence on different timelines. The challenge for military organizations was figuring out how to balance the investment in both types of intelligence collection, how to ensure that resources were allocated in ways that maximized the overall value of intelligence to the military command structure. The NATO air campaign benefited from both approaches. The broader understanding that the CIA program provided allowed NATO to understand the strategic choices that Milosevic was making and to anticipate how he might respond to the air campaign. The tactical intelligence that the SAS teams provided allowed NATO to strike moving targets and to prevent the Yugoslav military from consolidating positions and resources. But the existence of both programs raised a question about whether the CIA program was designed efficiently for the requirements of an active air campaign that needed to strike time-sensitive targets. The answer that emerged was that the CIA program was necessary, but not sufficient. And the SAS teams were necessary additions to the intelligence picture. Together, the two approaches created a more complete intelligence capability than either could create alone. By the time the air campaign ended in June 1999, Milosevic had agreed to cease military operations in Kosovo and to withdraw Serbian military forces from the province. The air campaign had succeeded in its strategic objective. The NATO air campaign had degraded the Yugoslav military's capability to continue its operations in Kosovo. The air campaign had also demonstrated that direct observation by human intelligence collectors could be a critical force multiplier for air operations. The 3 SAS soldiers in the Drenica Valley had not defeated the Yugoslav military by themselves, but they had helped NATO conduct airstrikes that were more effective than they would have been without direct observation. They had provided intelligence that the $40 million CIA program could not provide as quickly or as accurately. And they had demonstrated that in a situation where direct observation was possible, the combination of institutional intelligence programs and tactical human intelligence collection was superior to either capability operating alone. The broader lesson about intelligence management was clear. There was value in building large, comprehensive intelligence programs that could provide broad understanding of an adversary's intentions and capabilities. There was also value in deploying small numbers of human observers to positions where they could directly see what an adversary was doing. The challenge was managing both capabilities in a way that maximized the value of each. Intelligence organizations needed to understand the different timelines at which different sources of intelligence were effective. Strategic intelligence sources that provided broad understanding were valuable for making strategic decisions and for understanding adversary intentions. Tactical intelligence sources that provided real-time information about what an adversary was actually doing were valuable for making tactical decisions and enabling military operations to be more effective. Both kinds of intelligence were necessary. Neither was sufficient by itself. The integration of intelligence streams over the course of the air campaign revealed how difficult it was to coordinate between different intelligence sources operating on different timelines. Initially, the integration of spot reports from the SAS teams with the broader NATO targeting process had been awkward. The NATO Operations Center had procedures for receiving and processing intelligence from various sources. The procedures were designed around the assumption that intelligence would come through established channels. The procedures were designed around the assumption that intelligence would be processed, analyzed, and integrated with other intelligence before being acted upon. The spot reports from the SAS teams violated these procedures. The spot reports were coming through military channels rather than through intelligence channels. The spot reports were being acted upon immediately rather than being processed and analyzed. Over the course of the first week of the air campaign, the NATO Operations Center had to adapt its procedures to accommodate the spot reports from the SAS teams. The Operations Center had to establish a direct communications link between the SAS teams and the targeting cell. The Operations Center had to develop a procedure for prioritizing spot reports from the SAS teams relative to other intelligence about potential targets. The Operations Center had to establish a procedure for confirming the results of airstrikes against targets that had been identified by spot reports. By the end of the first week, the integration was working smoothly. The spot reports from the SAS teams were being received by the targeting cell. The targeting cell was immediately assessing the reports and making decisions about whether to divert air assets to strike the targets. The airstrikes were being conducted within minutes of the spot reports being received. The battle damage assessment was being conducted to confirm the results. The learning process was rapid because the value of the spot reports was immediately apparent. The targeting cell could see that airstrikes on targets that had been identified by spot reports had a much higher probability of success than airstrikes on targets that had been identified through other intelligence channels. The targeting cell could see that the spot reports were allowing them to conduct airstrikes on moving targets that would have been impossible to strike using intelligence that came through other channels. As the air campaign progressed, Milosevic's military began to adapt to the presence of the SAS teams. The Yugoslav military began to implement deception measures that were designed to complicate the air campaign. The Yugoslav military began to move assets at night and conceal them during the day. The Yugoslav military began to use camouflage and concealment techniques that were designed to prevent assets from being identified from the air. Despite these efforts, the SAS teams continued to operate and continued to provide spot reports. The teams were trained to avoid detection. The teams were equipped with communications equipment that was difficult to intercept. The teams were supplied by helicopter at night in ways that avoided detection. The teams maintained their presence in their operational areas despite the Yugoslav military's efforts to eliminate them. By the time the air campaign ended in June 1999, Milosevic had agreed to cease military operations in Kosovo and to withdraw Serbian military forces from the province. The air campaign had succeeded in its strategic objective. The NATO air campaign had degraded the Yugoslav military's capability to continue its operations in Kosovo. The air campaign had also demonstrated that direct observation by human intelligence collectors could be a critical force multiplier for air operations. The 3 SAS soldiers in the Drenica Valley had not defeated the Yugoslav military by themselves, but they had helped NATO conduct airstrikes that were more effective than they would have been without direct observation. They had provided intelligence that the $40 million CIA program could not provide as quickly or as accurately. And they had demonstrated that in a situation where direct observation was possible, the combination of institutional intelligence programs and tactical human intelligence collection was superior to either capability operating alone. The broader implications for NATO operations extended far beyond Kosovo. The success of the SAS teams in providing real-time intelligence to support the air campaign established a principle that would influence how NATO conducted operations in the decades that followed. The principle was that direct human observation in the operational area could provide intelligence value that could not be replicated through electronic means alone. The principle would be tested and validated in subsequent NATO operations in Afghanistan and in other theaters. The principle established that NATO should maintain the capability to insert human observers into operational areas where they could provide direct observation of military movements and military installations. The story of the 3 SAS soldiers in the Drenica Valley and the $40 million CIA program reveals something important about how intelligence organizations and military organizations manage intelligence. There is value in building large, comprehensive intelligence programs that can provide broad understanding of an adversary's intentions and capabilities. There is also value in deploying small numbers of human observers to positions where they can directly see what an adversary is doing. The challenge is managing both capabilities in a way that maximizes the value of each. The CIA program was not useless because the SAS teams were more effective at providing tactical intelligence. The CIA program was providing strategic intelligence that was essential for understanding the broader context in which the air campaign was operating. But the CIA program was not designed with the assumption that there would be direct observation teams on the ground, and the program's effectiveness at providing tactical intelligence was substantially less than the SAS team's effectiveness. The lesson is that intelligence organizations need to understand the different timelines at which different sources of intelligence are effective. Strategic intelligence sources that provide broad understanding are valuable for making strategic decisions and for understanding adversary intentions. Tactical intelligence sources that provide real-time information about what an adversary is actually doing are valuable for making tactical decisions and for enabling military operations to be more effective. Both kinds of intelligence are necessary, neither is sufficient by itself. The 3 SAS soldiers in the Drenica Valley demonstrated that tactical human intelligence collection, the presence of trained observers in positions where they can see what is actually happening, can be extraordinarily valuable in a military campaign. The $40 million CIA program demonstrated that strategic intelligence about an adversary's structure and intentions is also valuable. The NATO air campaign was most effective when both sources of intelligence were being used to inform operational decisions. By the time the air campaign ended, both the CIA and the British SAS had learned important lessons about how to conduct air campaigns that involved human intelligence collection. The lessons were that human intelligence collection could provide value that electronic intelligence could not provide. The lessons were that the integration of human intelligence collection with air operations could increase the effectiveness of air campaigns. The lessons were that investment in small numbers of highly trained personnel positioned in critical locations could provide returns that were disproportionate to the investment. These lessons would become foundational to how NATO and the intelligence organizations that supported NATO would approach military operations in subsequent decades. The Drenica Valley returned to relative quiet after the NATO air campaign ended and Yugoslav military forces withdrew from Kosovo. The SAS soldiers extracted and returned to their units. The CIA program was eventually wound down as the immediate crisis in the Balkans diminished. But the lesson remained. 3 men with a map and a radio, positioned where they could see what was actually happening, could accomplish what a much larger institutional program could not accomplish as quickly or as effectively. That lesson would shape how NATO conducted military intelligence operations in the years that followed. The presence of human intelligence capability deep inside the area of operations became an increasingly important part of NATO's approach to military campaigns. The investment in small numbers of highly trained personnel positioned in critical locations could provide returns that were disproportionate to the investment. The larger lesson extended beyond just intelligence management. The story revealed something fundamental about how military effectiveness in complex operating environments often depends more on the ability to see and act in real time than on the amount of resources available. The $40 million CIA program had been designed to answer strategic questions about Milosevic's intentions, capabilities, and likely responses. The program was comprehensive, well-resourced, and professionally executed, but it was not designed to answer the tactical questions of exactly where to direct airstrikes at specific moments when tactical windows were open and closing. The 3 SAS soldiers with their map and radio were designed precisely for that purpose. They were not trying to understand the strategic problem. They were trying to provide the information that would allow tactical decisions to be made in real time. The combination of both capabilities, strategic understanding and tactical real-time observation, proved to be more effective than either capability alone could have been. This principle would shape how NATO and other military organizations would approach military campaigns in the decades that followed the Kosovo air campaign. The implications for future military operations were significant. The principle that direct human observation could provide value that no amount of technology or money could replicate became embedded in NATO doctrine. The principle established that NATO should invest in maintaining small numbers of highly trained personnel who could be rapidly deployed to critical locations where they could provide direct observation of military movements. The principle established that the integration of human intelligence collection with air and ground operations could increase the effectiveness of military campaigns. These principles would be tested and validated repeatedly in subsequent NATO operations, particularly in Afghanistan, where similar patterns of embedding human observers with military units would prove to be critical to the effectiveness of military campaigns. The 3 SAS soldiers in the Drenica Valley had demonstrated that the value of direct human observation lay not in replacing institutional intelligence programs, but in complementing them, providing the real-time tactical information that those programs could not provide, no matter how well-resourced they were.